Fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery.
Well, welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren. We got Smoker Joe Goldberg here.
I mean, just was checking out a video because I'm on the Smoker this weekend for guests coming over. So you are
I
correct.
didn't get invited.
Well, are you allowed to come across the border?
Well, I think I'm allowed, but you never know. Who knows? Who knows nowadays? I better not have anything bad about Trump on my
That's true.
phone. Because
So come on down. Bite my lamb.
Oh, there you go. Where else can you get fresh cooked lamb? You know?
How's that for an offer?
Yeah, you couldn't ask for better, really. Young.
Yeah, it's either smoking something or writing something. It's pretty much my whole life.
Yeah. Well, what else is there, really?
Hey, what else is? I should read Michael's new book. That's what I should do.
Yes.
Yeah, Zodiac. Yeah, I heard that was a killer from.
I was going to say something stupid like that, but I'd let you do it.
Yeah, something like that. Zodiac sign, Zodiac Killer. So the book is called The Zodiac Killer. It's the story of America's most elusive murderer. Wow, sounds scary. Michael Butterfield, welcome back.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me, Al.
So how do you like it now that you've written the book and it's all done and it's all behind you? You glad you did it?
Yeah. It was a good experience for the most part. And it was good to, anytime you get a project like that, it's good to kind of force yourself to complete it before the deadline. Deadlines are good sometimes, and it also felt like a good thing to finally put it all out there on paper.
Right. Kind of solidifies. It's kind of a nice thing, right, to do that, and then you can move on from that point, right?
Yeah.
But I find with a case like this, it's not solved, right? There's still a lot of questions, and there's a lot.
Al, people solve this case every day.
Yeah, I know. Joe did it.
Well, I got a question about that. I'll get that. Let you guys talk first. I have a question.
Well, I was just going to say that when it's still moving forward, like things are getting, like ciphers are getting solved and things go on and stuff. Do you ever feel like you can really stop on one book when you do a book like this in a case like this?
It's hard. As soon as you finish the book, something else comes out. So you just have to deal with that and try to move on. Fortunately, my editor was kind enough to let me keep adding things. When something would come out, there was some DNA news during the period where the book was being edited, and I contacted them and said, hey, can I do an insert here with this paragraph about this? And can I change that and add this? And they were very accommodating. So, yeah, but, of course, when you have a word count limit, there's only so much you can put in. And so all that stuff that doesn't go in the book or things that happen afterwards, there's probably a whole nother book there.
So I got to ask the question as a novice outsider who's watched a few things. What keeps people from just saying, oh, another book about Zodiac? I mean, what is it that this is the community of Zodiacians, what you guys call yourselves, that makes this thing still alive all these decades later?
Well, I don't know if a lot of people think he's still alive. I mean, some of the most popular suspects are people who died a long time ago. When it comes to another book, unfortunately, most of the Zodiac books that come out are attached to a theory and a suspect. So they have that bias right from the start because they're trying to mold the story to fit their chosen pet suspect. My book is an attempt to tell the story, an overall look at the case over the last 5-something decades. And I don't have a suspect. I don't propose a solution. So hopefully some people will find that useful in that regard. And also the book tries to tell the story about the Zodiac case that is often overlooked or overshadowed by other people who have their suspects and theories. This is a book that just tries to tell the story and get the facts out there, and that's not the norm in Zodiac books.
Well, it's more exciting if you kind of come out saying, I've got the Zodiac Killer, it's so and so, and they did it this way, and then you can kind of throw all these things and saying why it's that person. But I guess it's really tough. So what are you going to, how can I say this? So you've done this, you've kind of put out, how do you draw the line between what's real fact and what's just thought? Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. Fortunately, we have a lot of the police reports, a lot of the FBI files, and I did a lot of research over the last 30-something years, talking to a lot of the people who were involved in the case, including the original investigators and people who were involved in other aspects of the story, including some suspects and families of the victims and a surviving victim and people like that. So, I try to look at this as a journalist would. I try to look at things and say, can this be verified? Is this corroborated? What are the problems with this witness statement and things like that? So, obviously there's certain situations where we won't ever probably know the truth about something because there's not enough information, or we need the killer to explain it to us. And so in those situations, I try to fall down on the side of the facts as much as I can.
Now, Michael, my wife and I watched the documentary on Netflix. I was on Netflix recently. I think I was actually texting Al as I was watching it, going, And we got done like, hey, this all sounds good to me. They took a point of view, right? It was Arthur Lee Allen and stuff like that. It's like,
yeah.
I mean, what does that do to the field of Zodiac study when that documentary? You were in that, right? Were you,
no, I was not in that one.
Okay.
Although they contacted me a couple of years ago and asked me to help them get a show produced with this trio of kids who knew Arthur Lee Allen. And it was pretty clear from the beginning that I wasn't going to be a good fit for them, because I've always been very critical of the claims regarding Allen. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And so I know for the average person, you see a documentary like that and you think, wow, this is a lot of new information and everything. But for a lot of us in the so-called Zodiac world, we've been aware of this stuff for a long time. And this is just one of many shows that are like that in many ways. So it's just kind of something that gets absorbed and things move on, because there's nothing definitive. There's nothing that solves the case in that show. So, it's becomes just another story that gets added to a very large and ever-growing pile.
And you're not one who goes up and puts out the press release saying, no, that's not correct. How can they possibly pick somebody? You just let it, as you say, absorb into the Zodiac universe.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stories about Arthur Lee Allen from a lot of different sources. You have to look at every one and examine them and check them against the facts and things like that. But yeah, I mean, the cottage industry of true crime now depends on a constant flow of new content. And so there are a lot of shows like this, because nowadays, if you have a Zodiac theory, you get your 15 seconds of infamy, you get your book and your interviews and your Netflix special. And that just seems to be the way things are now. I mean, if you remember, Al probably remembers this, Gary Stewart and his
that was my next
story.
question.
Yeah. They did a Netflix documentary that completely debunked his claims, along with those of us who debunked it as well. But I just saw the other day that they're making that book into a movie. So it's like, I guess you're just totally undeterred by that whole it's nonsense thing. But like I said, that's the way the industry is now. So we just kind of have to take it and move on.
Well, I think that it's becoming the norm to do a true crime event, like it's something that really happened, even if we know the killer, and they're taking it and they're turning it into a fictional story, right? Mm-hmm. They just did that. They're doing that of all that. Like they did a Son of Sam that way, where they just sort of created the whole story that's not based on anything. And they just did that with Rodney Keller. That was one of the books I wrote about, and that was a complete fantasy.
Yeah.
None of it, almost 90% of what they showed in there never happened. Just didn't happen. So, but it sells because everyone goes, oh, it's an exciting movie. It kept them on the edge of their toes or feet, or, they're all excited because it was a really scary show, but it's just made up.
Yeah. And that's not unusual. I mean, nobody seems to let the facts get in the way of telling a good story, right? So
It starts at the top, right?
yeah.
Get the facts. Well, how do you handle then the people like Gary Stewart? Or remember, wasn't it Steve Hodel too, that the cop? Wasn't it his grandfather that was supposed to be the Zodiac?
It was his father. It's all part of the Daddy Did It crowd now.
Yeah, like
that's a whole subgenre in Zodiac.
so. How do you handle that? Do you even mention it, or do you keep totally away from that?
Well, I was saying this in an interview the other day. I'm getting older, and I have other interests and limited time and things. So in the old days, when something would come out, I would buy the book, I would read the book, I'd sit down, like with Steve Hodel's book. I'll never forget, I was in the Strand bookstore in New York and saw his book there, and I bought it. And on the plane ride back, I took out a legal pad and just started writing down everything that was wrong with the book. And by the time we landed, the pad was almost full. And I came back and I wrote a review, and then I wrote a follow-up on other things and stuff, trying to show, what was wrong with his book and why his theory wasn't sound. And that was kind of the pattern. And I have a extremely large true crime book collection here in my office, and the shelves devoted to Zodiac are filled with those kinds of books. And at a certain point, it's not just that you want to stop buying them because you don't want to support that, you want to kind of discourage that kind of behavior, but also I just don't have the time, the energy, or the desire to waste hours and hours and hours reading and debunking nonsense. So at a certain point, you kind of make a cost benefit analysis, like how important is it for me to respond to this or write something about it? And it usually comes down to a few factors, one of which is anybody really taking this seriously? And although, these books sell and they get their TV shows and stuff, sometimes you need to just look at it and say, it's not really worth devoting all the time to this. I mean, Gary Stewart, after that Netflix special came out, which thoroughly debunked his claims, the very night that the show aired, he was on Facebook saying, be sure to buy my book so you can see all the compelling evidence that the TV show didn't talk about. And it was like, well, there's nothing in your book that the TV show didn't debunk. So he knew what he was doing. And in that regard, it's like, well, I'm not going to keep responding to this drivel and keep giving it attention. So I've kind of learned in the last few years to sort of sit back and see how things play out and whether or not it's worthy of a comment. And more often than not, it doesn't seem to be worthy of it because the majority of people seem to recognize that kind of stuff for what it is.
Yeah. Well, you can't win anyway, right?
No, because you could write it like Steve Hodel. I wrote that whole article pointing out all of these major problems with his claims, and then he still goes and does presentations where he puts that stuff up on a screen. So it's like, it's not going to stop people.
Yeah. There's not much you can do with all of that. So at the end of the day, do you have a suspect at the end of all this time? Do you have a feeling about any one or two people, or do you just not really think we know who the Zodiac really is?
Yeah, I tend to fall onto the side that the Zodiac is going to be, if and when they catch the Zodiac or identify him, he'll turn out to be someone who was never named as a suspect, probably never even investigated. That's my personal opinion. There are some suspects that are interesting, but I don't see anything that would justify believing that they're the Zodiac. And then, there's always people like Arthur Lee Allen, which is kind of a de facto default suspect. And you kind of, if they were to find something that proved Allen was the Zodiac, that would be great. I wouldn't be upset that it turned out to be him, because that would mean that the case was solved. But, I'm asked that question all the time. And the most honest answer is I don't see anything that would indicate that any of these named suspects was the Zodiac. So therefore, I don't see any reason to believe that they were. And until somebody provides something, that's probably where I'm going to stay. I don't have a suspect. I think that once you declare a suspect in public and you promote that idea, it clouds your thinking and your judgment, and it damages your credibility and your objectivity. And so, there are a few people who have suspects who manage to walk that line pretty carefully. But for the most part, it usually leads to bias and going down the wrong road.
I heard he was Jewish and lived in Chicago.
Yeah, outside Chicago, thank you. So, from the outside novice watching this special point of view, maybe pick up a book every once in a while, is the reason the Zodiac lives on in research and your new book is because we're in a society that needs resolution and it hasn't been resolved? Not what he did or how he did it, or maybe that's how it started, but now it's just unsolved and we need to have the answer?
Well, I think it could be a little bit of both. I mean, in many ways, the Zodiac was unique. He wore a bizarre hooded costume with his symbol on the chest when he committed one of his crimes, sent taunting letters to the media, called police to report his crimes, threatened to assassinate school children on a bus. Just so many aspects of the case are unique or on something that other killers had done before. And I think his persona in history, this odd behavior, these aspects of his crimes. But I think, part of it is that it's unsolved. I don't know about you guys, but I hate mysteries.
Yeah.
I love solved mysteries. That's one of the reasons why I love watching Columbo, because they show you who did it right at the beginning.
Yep.
And after that, it's all about the hunt and how is he going to figure it out and things like that. So an unsolved case is automatically a draw because there's mystery there. But I think at the same time, over the years, the legend of the Zodiac has kind of taken over a lot of the public perception due to a lot of these kinds of specials and things. So there's this notion that the answer is just below the surface. If you just dig a little bit more, you'll find it. And it could be your uncle, it could be your brother-in-law, it could be your neighbor, and that's very appealing to people, sort of the amateur detective aspect of it. But I think there were serial killers like the Green River Killer, the BTK Strangler, the Golden State Killer, and then there was Zodiac. These were kind of the big unsolved cases. And each one of them was viewed as this sort of legendary, mythical figure, this creeping murderer who got away with it for decades and things. But then, as each one of those people were caught and identified, a lot of that mystique just vanished, because instead of thinking of this ghost-like figure, this ominous legendary killer, now you're looking at some pathetic old man sitting in a chair in a courtroom. And it automatically removes a lot of the mystique. So I think part of the mystique around the Zodiac is that he hasn't been identified. And if he was identified, I think a lot of people would suddenly realize that he wouldn't live up to that legend.
I sort of think, unfortunately, but I sort of think that what would happen is if they did identify someone, there would still be a group of people that wouldn't believe that was the right person.
Oh, God, yeah. There's people who have devoted their whole lives to claiming that they have solved this case. And we saw a little bit of what you're talking about when the 340 cipher, one of the Zodiac's 4 ciphers, was finally solved after over 50 years back in 2020. For a lot of us, we looked at that and we're like, yeah, they've obviously solved this, and this is a milestone in the case. And even though the solution didn't reveal the killer's identity or any clues or anything, it was resolution of one aspect of the case. But there were a lot of people who had their theories and their pet suspects around that cipher, who immediately rejected the solution and questioned it and claimed that the people who had solved the cipher were wrong and their solution was still correct. So yeah, when faced with the facts, they couldn't deal with it. And I think there's some people like that who, if the Zodiac was identified, even if he came forward and confessed and had evidence connecting him to the case, there would still be people who would reject it or claim that there was more to the story, or that their suspect was his accomplice, or things like that. I mean, that's just, people can't deal with it.
Yeah, they set him up, or they.
Yeah.
There's always the they.
Faked it. He faked it. It's misinformation and 3D printing.
Yeah.
All that
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah, it's not real.
Well, I still get emails from people who are like, they stole my solution, and it's like, well, these guys were expert computer programmers who invented software to help solve this cipher. I'm sure that they didn't need to steal from you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of crazy in a way. Hey, and what about okay? So, what about the first murder in Riverside? Now, a lot of people there's a divide on whether that was a Zodiac killing or not.
Oh yeah, yeah. The Riverside Police Department. This was an unsolved case from 1966. Sherry Jo Bates was murdered near the campus of Riverside City College. And shortly afterwards, someone sent a typed confession letter taking responsibility for the crime. And then about 6 months later, somebody sent 3 virtually identical handwritten letters that said, in effect, Bates had to die, there will be more. And there was a little symbol at the bottom that looked somewhat like a letter Z. And back in 1969, the Riverside Police Department thought that it was possible the Zodiac was responsible, and they contacted Bay Area investigators with this theory, and they sort of ran with this idea that the Zodiac was probably responsible, and at least one handwriting expert concluded that those 3 letters had been written by the Zodiac. So then the Bates murder started to become known as the first Zodiac murder, or at the very least an early Zodiac murder. And then the Riverside Police Department reversed course and said, no, it wasn't Zodiac. It was this guy that knew the victim, and that's our suspect now. So that started this schism, you might say. So over the years, a lot of people have taken one or the other side in that regard. And it's interesting to note that the Zodiac connection was often based on that handwriting analysis and the killer's behavior, the writing letters and things like that. But a few years back, the Riverside Police announced that they had, I think it was in 2016, they had received a letter from someone who claimed to be the author of those 3 handwritten letters from 1967. And through some DNA work and an investigation, they were able to identify this individual who reportedly confessed to writing those 3 letters as a sick joke, as a hoax. And the person was a teenager at the time and said, they regretted doing it, but investigators determined that person was not responsible for the Bates murder or the Zodiac crime. So now those 3 handwritten letters, according to the Riverside Police Department, have nothing to do with either of those 2 cases. So that was a big breakthrough, but it did sort of put a dent in a lot of people's theories who would try to connect those letters to the case. It was a great breakthrough, and it's great for us to know who did it, but unfortunately it didn't advance the case at all, except for removing this aspect. So the case still remains unsolved, just like the Zodiac case.
So, Michael, let me go macro here. Let me go wide angle. Once again, from my point of view, is we had interviewed somebody who called this period of that time of all the people you listed off as a golden age of serial killers. And I don't make light of this. It's horrible and people are dying and the like. But do you have any thoughts about why was that happening then and maybe not happening now? What was it about that time period?
Well, I think that there's probably several factors involved. One of them being mobility. I back in the day when I was taking some college classes, I took a criminal justice class and I wrote a paper about how the advent of freeways had introduced serial murder on a larger scale in America, because a killer could get in his car and get on the freeway and drive for 15 minutes and be in a completely different area and neighborhood where he wouldn't be recognized. I also think it has a lot to do with the freedom that we had in the United States, the anonymity of people to be able to move around freely and go unnoticed. But I also think, I mean, Peter Vronsky has written a great book about how this sort of connects to the end of World War II and returning soldiers who were dealing with issues. Not that that leads to serial killing, but that it created an environment where a lot of people weren't dealing with mental health issues, and people growing up in a society where violence is more prevalent than it may have been before, or at least the reporting of it. So, and I think also it may have something to do with those generations at that time. Nowadays, with technology, the advances in technology, somebody like the Zodiac would probably be caught pretty quickly. There's the last known murder of the Zodiac where he killed a cab driver in San Francisco in this upscale neighborhood. And some witnesses saw him getting out of the cab and walking away. And today somebody would just pull out a camera and take a picture of him. And that would probably be the end of it. But I think that people like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, a lot of the people that came in the 80s, like the Green River Killer and people like that, it has a lot to do with the freedom that we have to move about and the anonymity in society. So somebody like Ted Bundy would probably be caught a lot quicker today than he would have been back then for some of the same reasons about technology. But, there's an interesting book. I think it's called Urge to Kill. And it's about in California in the 70s, how there were several killers working in the same area, and their work was often being mistaken for the work of the other. And it was, Richard Trenton Chase, Ed Kemper, and Herbert Mullen. And when you look at that, it's got a lot to do with geography as well. The state of California produces more serial killers than any other state in the country. And part of that's because of the size, the population, but it's also about mobility and anonymity.
Yeah, Peter's book is pretty good. What, Sons of Cain or something, I think? Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. Pretty interesting. Well, and also it's kind of strange that, look at the murders up in BC on that Highway of Tears, they call it, and how it's become a thing for, 40, 50 years now.
Yeah.
So it's not the same killer, but people take advantage of it being a place where they can get away with it.
Yeah. And Joe, I think it's a good thing to note too, that how many serial killers are there out there whose public persona nickname in the media is related to a freeway, like the I-5 killer, the I-45 killer, it's unfortunately a part of that aspect of crime that is probably not going to go away anytime soon, because again, if you can commit a crime and then drive away and be somewhere else, be tens of miles away in a matter of minutes, that's going to contribute to the ongoing crime problem.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Those same highways, interstates, freeways, they all created an isolation in the communities as well.
Yeah.
Which is something I'm going through that in the 60s, working on a Manson thing. Yeah, and there's people that think Manson was Zodiac.
Yeah.
Like, how does that happen?
Well, part of it originated just from very pragmatic observations back in the 60s, because the Zodiac left a handwritten message on a car door at Lake Berryessa, where he put his cross circle symbol and the dates of the crimes and the method by knife and things like that. And of course, the Manson killers left handwritten messages in blood at some of the crime scenes. So I think right away, that was something that people looked at. Also, because I think the whole Manson thing back at that time was so terrifying and outrageous, this idea of these group of killers. It was easy to see them as being more sinister and evil and somehow behind every corner and in every shadow and responsible for so many other crimes. But a major part of that comes from a story that surfaced where someone claimed that the Los Angeles DA, the district attorney's office, while investigating the Manson murders and preparing for the trials, had discovered the hood worn by the Zodiac amongst the Manson possessions, and a knife and and other things, and that the DA's office conspired to cover up this connection and concealed and ultimately destroyed that evidence for reasons which make no sense whatsoever. The story was that if they prosecuted, because the theory was that it was Bruce Davis who was carrying out the Zodiac crimes, Charles Manson's so-called right-hand man. And so the theory was that if they tried to prosecute him for the Zodiac murders, they might lose his convictions for his other murders for some reason, which of course makes no sense whatsoever. And then there was stories that the trial would be too expensive, and rather than go through that expense, they would just cover up this connection to another major crime and destroy the evidence and keep it a secret, which of course makes no sense. And then there was also the excuse given that the wives and girlfriends of the Manson investigators were just too tired of all of this. And so they decided to cover up this massive conspiracy. Of course, the story is pure nonsense. It was attributed to the person making this claim said that their former brother-in-law had worked for the LADA's office and was the source for this story. And when I finally contacted that person, of course, he said, I never said anything like that. And whoever's saying that doesn't know what they're talking about, and it's nonsense. You know, just like I was saying earlier, even after I published an article filled with all of the information that shows that this is just can't be taken seriously, it didn't deter anyone. Those people just keep telling that story as if it's true. And I've always thought it was funny that when I finally contacted Vincent Bugliosi, who prosecuted Manson, to ask him about this connection in the LADA's office and what he thought of this theory, he said, it's just pure unadulterated insanity. And that was a great blurb, a great quote to use, but he made a great point. First of all, that this entire conspiracy story, as it's described, is a crime. It's a very serious crime. And you're asking us to believe that all these people participated in this conspiracy for no good reason, for no positive outcome. It makes no sense whatsoever. But then he also said, if we had evidence that Manson committed more crimes than we knew of previously, why would anybody cover that up for him? If anything, the instinct would be to throw everything you've got at him, because they were after Charles Manson. They did not want him to, get out and be free. So there's no logical explanation for why anybody would have covered that up. And of course, it doesn't really make any sense that they were involved at all. And the San Francisco investigators went to Los Angeles back then during the investigation and examined this theory and concluded that no one in the Manson family was involved in the Zodiac murders. Now, of course, somebody's going to say, well, that doesn't prove that they weren't, but at the same time, there's no evidence that they were.
That's really interesting. And it makes me want to ask a question based upon my teaching my social media classes. Conspiracy theories and conspiracies. Is there something that was a crazy conspiracy theory that became conspiracy that was proven at some point along Zodiac that you went, okay, this wacky conspiracy theory actually was something?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. I don't think there was anything that you would call a conspiracy. There are a lot of mini mysteries that some people attach to conspiracy, like in the last known Zodiac murder of the cab driver in San Francisco, the killer walked away, walked a block north and made a right and kept going. And some police officers who were responding to the scene, according to the officer who was driving the car, he said he saw this individual, but the individual didn't match the description of the killer that had been broadcast because there was a mistake. The mistake was that the killer was accidentally described as a black man instead of a white man. So when the police were approaching, he said that he saw this white man walking down the street. He observed him, and then he kept going. And then he found out, according to this officer, then he found out that the description had been wrong. And when he heard the correct description, he realized that it matched the person that he had just seen. and they sped off looking for him and couldn't find him. And this was near the Presidio military base in the Presidio Heights neighborhood in San Francisco. And so police poured into the area with lights and motorcycles and patrol cars and looked for this killer and everything. Couldn't find him. And then shortly after that, when the Zodiac sent a letter taking credit for it, he mocked police for failing to catch him. And then in a later letter, he said that 2 police officers had stopped and talked to him and then let him go. And the police denied this. But over the years, there's been a conspiracy theory that's formed around that. Depending on what you believe, it's confined to the 2 officers in the car who people claim were lying about stopping him. Or according to other theories, it's a bigger conspiracy involving other people as well to conceal the fact that San Francisco police stopped the killer and let him go, even though he may have been covered in blood, because he had handled the victim who he just shot in the head, handled the victim's body inside the cab, and took a large portion of the cab driver's shirt, which he later sent scraps from to prove that he was connected to the crime. So I can't think of any other things that are considered conspiracy theories, especially anything that turned out to be true. But in this particular instance, one of the police officers who was in that car died a few months later, unfortunately, and there's no official record of anything that he said about that night, although some people claim that he said that he did stop the Zodiac and let him go. The surviving officer, Don Falk, adamantly denied stopping the killer that night, and I tend to believe him in that regard. There's other problematic issues around his statements regarding where he last saw the killer and things like that, or the killer's description. But I tend to believe him because the story doesn't really make a whole lot of sense if you look at it just from a factual, common sense point of view. And then there's the fact that, the story came from the Zodiac. So
reliable
he's
sourcing.
not really, he's not a trustworthy individual. And it was very self-serving of him to come up with this story. But I think it's very telling that when he sent the first letter, he mocked police for not searching the park properly and for failing to catch him. And it wasn't until I think like a month later where he sent another letter. And then like on page 3, he included this story about the police stopping him. If I was a serial killer who was trying to embarrass the police, I would have led with that story instead of burying it on page 3. And I think it's also important to note that, he was almost caught that night and he barely escaped. Largely, it seems, because of that incorrect description. So a part of him was probably pretty spooked about what happened and may have been a little angry about it, especially when after he sent his first letter, the police called him a clumsy criminal, said that they had a description of him that produced a sketch and that they had his fingerprints. And I think he was angered by that. And to me, it makes a lot more sense to believe that he remembered seeing those police drive by him and decided to use that as the basis to make up a story he hoped would humiliate the police.
Well, weren't they giving out the polio vaccinations then? He was probably chipped. Make that part of the conspiracy. Come on.
Pre-5G.
Yeah. And Bugliosi, now, so was he really, I've been learning a lot of stuff about him. Like, was he really kind of not a good prosecutor or a bad person? Did he, like, with the mailman thing, and you've heard that story, right?
Yeah. There's room to criticize Vincent Bugliosi for things that he did. You can, if you have a problem with his political ambition or his exploitation of the Manson case, people are entitled to their opinions, but I think that it's kind of gotten out of control the way that people are trying to portray him as some kind of sinister figure who covered up the real truth behind the Manson murders and stuff like that. He was doing his job. His job was to convict those people. A lot of people like to say, well, the whole helter-skelter thing was just, something Vincent Bugliosi made up to prosecute them and everything. Is it true that he probably exaggerated that to help him get them convicted? Perhaps. But at the same time, there are people in the Manson case, the Manson family, who told that story as well. I mean, if I remember correctly, there's a recording of Leslie Van Houten talking about it and other people talking about it as well. So all I can tell you is that when I had to deal with Vincent Bugliosi, he was extremely generous. He was very helpful. He was very encouraging. He never tried to divert me to one point of view or another. He just told me what he thought and said, you're going to have to think for yourself and find out for yourself. When I would come up with some information through research and I went to check it through him, I never got the sense that he was trying to divert me to a particular point of view or divert me away from anything. And he was extremely open to new information. He told me, keep me posted. Let me know what you find out about this. I really want to know. I'm curious. So, maybe I'm biased because in my personal interactions with him, he was kind to me. But at the same time, I just think that people are looking for a villain in that story and to try to propel a different narrative, which ultimately I don't find very convincing. This whole, Manson and the CIA and that there was a cover up and things like that. I just,
please
to
stop.
me, that's
silly. That's silly. Tom
Yeah.
O'Neill and that whole thing is silly.
Yeah. And I think that's it sort of plays into the same kind of thing with Maury Terry's Ultimate Evil book, where he claimed that Son of Sam murders were all part of a satanic conspiracy involving a worldwide satanic cult that included Charles Manson and things like that. I guess people find that entertaining and they think it's interesting, but when somebody's claiming that, Manson was involved in the CIA and, there's Maury Terry, after he wrote The Ultimate Evil and that sort of became this huge sensation, he did a TV show with Geraldo Rivera called, it's sad that all you have to do is say that name and people laugh, but he did this show called Now It Can Be Told. And they did this 2-part investigation of the Zodiac case. And of course, they immediately concluded that a satanic cult was behind the Zodiac murders. But their whole presentation was, this was part of the really sloppy and sleazy tabloid television from the 80s and 90s, like, A Current Affair and Inside Edition and all those kinds of things that would be on in the afternoon in syndication. And they were just trying to come up with sensational stories. And the whole Zodiac satanic cult thing, if you watch those episodes, I think they're on YouTube. You can watch them. They're very much like Rivera's big 2-hour special, Satan's Underground, the exposing satanic cults in America, which was just as dumb as his whole Al Capone's vault thing, where he for 2 hours told people we're going to open this vault, and then after the end of the show there was nothing in it, and that's basically what their whole Zodiac investigation was like. But it's like a little time capsule of that period, which coincided with the surge in true crime interest and the whole satanic panic thing that was going on in the 80s. So it just fed into a lot of people's ideas about Satanism and that there were these Satanists in every shadow in your neighborhood molesting children and killing them in satanic rites and things like that. It's all nonsense. And unfortunately, I think that sort of way of looking at things has expanded now into things like the book Chaos and the Sons of Sam Netflix special and that kind of thing. There's an appetite for it. That's sort of a subgenre. And I don't think you're ever going to be able to get away from it. There's always going to be people who want that kind of content. And there are always going to be people who are willing to make it.
Yeah. They, it's all I can say is you get Tom O'Neill appearing on, Joe Rogan, right?
Yes.
And it says it all,
Yeah. I mean, that's not where you go if you're trying to be a credible journalist.
Yeah. It's pretty sad. But that's kind of where it's gone, right? So anyway, well, we appreciate you being here. So let's talk about where people find you and find the book. You're all over the place.
Yeah. You can go to zodiackillerfacts.com, and on the first page there's some links to buy the book. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and a lot of other vendors. I put links on my first page to that. The book seems to be selling well. Amazon seems to keep running out of stock and then replenishing it. The reviews have been mostly positive. So people can go to my website there and get that information. And also, in addition to this show that I'm doing today with you, which I'm very glad that you had me on because it's been quite a long time since we chatted. I also did some recent shows which were very interesting, including a 5-part interview with a podcast called The Consult, Real FBI Profilers, where I sat in with 3 former FBI profilers and we examined the 4 known Zodiac crimes, and then they came up with a profile. I thought it turned out to be a very informative and interesting show, and there's a link to that on the main page of my website as well. And I'll continue to post updates about the book there. It's also available in Kindle and audiobook.
Well, there you go. Fantastic. Of course, we'll have all that up on our website so people can find you real quick. So, Michael Butterfield, the Zodiac Killer. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.